Before satellites, before explorers, before history even began, there were maps. Maps drawn with knowledge no ancient civilization should have possessed. They depicted continents still undiscovered, coastlines free of ice long before the ice, age ended, and islands that no longer exist. Who drew them? How did they know what only the heavens could reveal? Tonight, we unfold the parchments of the impossible and trace the ink lines that connect ancient memory to forgotten worlds. This is not just geography. It's a map to humanity's lost beginning. The sea was always a vast mirror for human curiosity, endless, merciless, and alive with secrets. Long before satellites carved the earth into neat grids, sailors trusted the pulse of the stars and the whisper of the horizon. They sketched coastlines by instinct, by storms, by rumor. Maps born not of certainty, but of faith. And yet, in the year 1513, one man drew a map so precise, so impossible that centuries later, even the most skeptical minds would tremble before its lines. His name was Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral, cartographer, and scholar of the seas. And the parchment he left behind would defy every rule of history. The Piri Reis map was discovered in 1929, tucked away in the dusty archives of Istanbul's Topkapi Palace. When historians unrolled it, the air itself seemed to still. The faded ink revealed not only the coasts of Europe and Africa, well within the reach of 16th century navigation, but also the unmistakable outline of South America's eastern shore. That alone was remarkable. But the true astonishment lay further south. There, along the lower edge of the map, appeared a coastline that seemed out of place, smooth, curved, and hauntingly familiar. It was Antarctica, drawn centuries before its official discovery in 1820. More unsettling still, the map depicted the Antarctic coastline without its thick shroud of ice, revealing mountain ranges and valleys that modern sonar would not confirm until the mid-20th century. How could such knowledge exist in 1513, long before anyone could have seen it? The questions spread like wildfire through the corridors of academia. Some dismissed the map as coincidence, a flawed projection, a misinterpreted stretch of South America. Others felt something colder in their veins. The details, the scale, the mathematical precision. These were not the marks of guesswork. They hinted at something older, something forgotten. When scholars translated Piri Reis's notes scrawled in the margins, they found his own words confessing that his map was not his alone. He had compiled it from about 20 charts and Mappae Mundi, ancient sources, he said, drawn by the time of Alexander the Great and even earlier. He did not claim genius, he claimed inheritance. And so began the Great Whisper, the idea that Piri Reis had glimpsed a map of the world preserved from a civilization long lost, one that had known the true shape of the earth before ice, before flood, before the veil of time fell. It is easy now, in our age of satellites and GPS, to forget the magic of maps, how they once served as windows into the unknown. Each line was a prayer, each coast a confession of awe. The men who drew them did not merely trace geography. They tried to trap the mystery of existence itself. The Piri Reis map in its fragile parchment is like a message in a bottle thrown across centuries, reaching us from an era when myth and truth were indistinguishable. But who could have known Antarctica beneath the ice? The continent, as we see it today, lies buried under layers up to 3 kilometers thick. Only in the 20th century did seismic surveys and satellite imaging reveal the land beneath, a rugged terrain, with mountains and basins remarkably similar to what appears on the Piri Reis map. The match is eerie, almost deliberate. If Piri Reis was truly copying from older sources, then those maps must have been drawn when Antarctica was free of its ice, at least 6,000 years ago, perhaps 12,000. The last time that might have been true was near the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose and civilizations were swept away like sand. Could there have been an ancient people sailing the world when mammoths still roamed the tundra? Could their knowledge have survived through Egypt, through Greece, through the hidden corridors of time, only to resurface in the hands of an Ottoman admiral? In the quiet of his study, One can imagine Piri Reis bent over his parchment, his quill tracing the faint outlines of forgotten continents. Outside, the call to prayer echoed across Istanbul's domes, mingling with the sound of waves breaking on the Bosphorus. He must have known that he was copying something beyond comprehension, a relic of a world that should not have been known. His notes speak of maps drawn in the time of Alexander, but what of the maps drawn before Alexander, the ones whispered about in myths, Atlantean, antediluvian, celestial? Perhaps he did not believe them, but he drew them anyway, respecting the ghosts of those earlier cartographers. After all, to map the world is to defy mystery, and to defy mystery is to risk awakening it. Centuries later, when modern scientists examined the map, their reactions mirrored the mix of wonder and unease that must have filled Piri Reis himself. Charles Hapgood, a historian at Keene State College in the 20th century, studied it with a meticulous eye. He proposed that the Piri Reis map, along with other ancient charts like those of Orontius Phineas and Buache, preserved fragments of a prehistoric global survey, evidence of a civilization with advanced geographic knowledge that had somehow vanished. Albert Einstein himself, intrigued by Hapgood's research, called his theory not altogether impossible. That was all it took. The idea of a lost ancient world, capable of mapping the globe before recorded history, was reborn in the modern imagination. And yet history resists the romantic. Mainstream scholars insist that the coastline on the Piri Reis map is not Antarctica at all, but a distorted view of South America stretching too far south due to primitive projection methods. They argue that the resemblances are illusion, the human mind's hunger for patterns, reading meaning into coincidence. They point to the errors in the map, the uneven scales, the medieval conventions. And yet the feeling persists. There is something about that lower coast, that haunting curve of land, that refuses to fade into mere error. It feels intentional, like a whisper through the paper, insisting that it was meant to be there. Perhaps the greater mystery is not whether the map is accurate, but why it exists at all. The early 1500s were a time of fervent discovery. Columbus had crossed the Atlantic 2 decades earlier, Magellan's voyage was on the horizon, and the known world was expanding faster than imagination could contain it. Yet even in that age of daring exploration, Piri Reis's map was extraordinary. His depiction of South America's eastern shore was more precise than anything in Europe at the time. His positioning of Africa and the Atlantic islands showed uncanny accuracy, as if his sources had been drawn from an aerial view, an impossibility, unless the ancients had means of observation far beyond what we attribute to them. Could ancient mariners have charted the earth using methods we've forgotten? The Polynesians read waves like scripture, the Phoenicians steered by stars invisible to most. Knowledge, like the tide, rises and recedes. Perhaps the sea remembers what humanity forgets. If some early civilization mastered navigation at a global scale, their legacy might linger not in monuments of stone but in fragments of ink and parchment, misunderstood and misfiled through the ages. There's an old saying among sailors, "The map is not the territory." But what if, in this case, the map is the memory of a territory, one erased from the physical world, yet lingering in human consciousness like a dream? The deeper one dives into the riddle of the Piri Reis map, the more it feels less like a historical artifact and more like a riddle written in 2 languages, one human, one mythic. The human side tells us about Piri Reis the Admiral, a man of precision, pride, and empire. The mythic side whispers of forgotten epochs, of continents rising and falling, of compasses guided by stars that no longer burn. Between those 2 voices lies the truth, or something close to it. Imagine for a moment that somewhere in the mists of prehistory, there existed a culture whose reach spanned oceans. Perhaps they were the remnants of a civilization remembered. In stories as Atlantis or Mu, their ships tracing coastlines now submerged. When cataclysm came, flood, ice, fire, their knowledge was passed down in fragments, through Egyptian priests, through Greek scholars, through sailors who never understood the weight of what they carried. By the time it reached Piri Reis, It was a ghost, an echo copied faithfully line by line but stripped of its origin. And so the Admiral's map may be a palimpsest of time itself, ancient hands guiding his, unseen and unremembered. Each stroke of his quill may have been guided not by sight but by inheritance, an inheritance so ancient it predates language. There's a quiet poetry to that idea. We often think of history as a straight road, one era leading neatly into the next. But perhaps it is a circle, or a tide, or a pattern of rise and collapse. Knowledge does not simply accumulate, it also erodes. The ancients built pyramids aligned with the stars, carved calendars that tracked celestial cycles with eerie precision, and constructed cities whose ruins still defy modern engineering. The Piri Reis map might simply be another piece of that grand puzzle, a reminder that humanity's first story is not one of ignorance but of loss. And yet, there's something even more haunting to consider. What if the Piri Reis map was not meant for us at all? What if it was never intended to survive these centuries? Maps, after all, are tools, practical, transient. They guide journeys, and when the journey ends, they are discarded. The fact that this one endures, that it found its way into the hands of modern scholars, feels almost deliberate, as if history itself conspired to let it surface, a breadcrumb leading us backward through time. Perhaps it's not a message about the past, but a mirror held up to the present, asking us to remember what we've forgotten, that knowledge, no matter how advanced, is fragile, and that even the greatest empires can vanish, leaving only faint outlines behind. The true mystery of the Piri Reis map may not be what it shows, but what it symbolizes. It represents the unbroken thread of human wonder, the desire to see beyond the horizon, to understand the unknown, to leave a mark that outlasts the tides. Whether drawn from ancient atlases or the imagination of a visionary admiral, it is, in the end, an act of faith. Faith that the world, though vast and terrible, can be known. And perhaps that is the greatest secret hidden within its fading ink, that the boundaries of the possible are written not by time, but by curiosity. In the silence of the archive where it rests today, under glass and dim light, the Piri Reis map still seems alive. Its colors, though faded, hum with an old intelligence. The parchment carries the scent of salt and dust, the smell of centuries spent in the company of mystery. Scholars still argue over its meaning, still trace its contours with gloved hands, still feel that same jolt of disbelief that first rippled through the Topkapi Palace in 1929. And outside, the world it once described continues to turn, reshaped by technology, yet still fundamentally unknown. There are still places in the deep ocean that no eye has seen, still ridges beneath the Antarctic ice that remain untouched, still questions older than any map. The Piri Reis map is not an answer. It is a question disguised as a relic. It asks, how much have we forgotten? It asks whether knowledge is a ladder we climb or a circle we travel endlessly, losing and rediscovering what we once knew. It whispers that history is not a straight line but a labyrinth. And sometimes, if you listen closely, the past can be heard calling from beneath the ice. Perhaps, somewhere deep in the buried cold of Antarctica, the truth still sleeps, frozen, patient, waiting for its time to return. And when it does, perhaps another map will emerge, just as impossible, just as haunting, proving that the lines between myth and memory are not boundaries at all, only coastlines drawn by those who dared to believe the world was larger than their eyes could see. The world remembers in fragments. We find its memories buried in stone, carved into forgotten temples, whispered through myths that refuse to die. Sometimes the earth itself becomes a kind of witness, mountain ranges shaped by unseen hands, coastlines that recall the shape of vanished lands, and patterns in the stars that seem too deliberate to be chance. From the deserts of Egypt to the jungles of Central America, from the Andes to the ocean floor, the echoes of something older, something impossibly vast, hum beneath our history. They surface in stories of lost continents, divine floods, and golden ages when humankind walked with gods. But perhaps they are not only stories. Perhaps they are memories, distorted by time, retold by survivors of a forgotten world. For as long as we have kept records, humanity has spoken of a great civilization that came before, a world that rose to brilliance and then fell beneath the waves. Plato wrote of it as Atlantis, a mighty power destroyed in a single day and night of misfortune. The Sumerians told of Eridu, the first city from which knowledge descended. Hindu texts describe the lost land of Kumarikandam, drowned by rising seas. In the myths of the Andes, Viracocha, the bearded god, wandered after a flood, teaching the scattered tribes the arts of civilization. Across cultures, across millennia, the pattern repeats, the memory of teachers who came from afar, of knowledge rekindled rather than born anew. Could all these voices be speaking of the same event, the same ancient catastrophe? If so, what kind of people left behind such a legacy? Who were these ancient astronomers, these master builders, these keepers of world knowledge, who mapped the heavens and the earth long before our recorded history began? We call them Atlanteans or antediluvians, but those are only names, symbols, for something larger than language. They may not have called themselves anything at all. Their memory survives not in their words, but in the silent perfection of the things they made. The pyramids whose alignments mirror constellations, the megaliths that still resist explanation, the precise calendars that track celestial movements to the second. All around us their fingerprints remain. And yet it is in the maps, the impossible maps, that their presence feels closest. The Piri Reis map, the Oronteus Phineus map, the Boache map, all show a world far older and more complete than any medieval scholar should have known. Continents drawn with uncanny precision, mountains and rivers that were only rediscovered with modern instruments. These maps, say the skeptics, are simply errors, projections distorted by ignorance. But to others they are evidence, fragments of a once unified understanding of the planet, preserved by a lineage of initiates through the collapse of ages. The ancients who first drew them may have lived in a time when the poles were ice-free, when sea levels were lower, when coastlines stretched farther. They may have mapped the earth not as we know it, but as it once was, and perhaps as it will be again. Imagine for a moment the end of the Ice Age, the Great Thaw, around 12,000 years ago. Vast glaciers melting, oceans rising, hundreds of feet, swallowing plains, deltas, and cities built near the sea. It was a time of chaos, a flood so immense that whole landscapes vanished in a single generation. Geological evidence confirms that the planet experienced violent shifts then, rapid climate swings, and catastrophic floods that could well match the myths. To those who lived through it, it would have felt like the end of the world. Yet perhaps, it was also the end of something greater, the fall of a civilization that had already mastered geometry, astronomy, and the art of navigation. If that civilization had global reach, if it mapped the coasts of continents and charted the skies, then when the waters came, its survivors might have fled to higher ground, carrying fragments of their knowledge with them. They would have become the wanderers, the bearers of light in the darkness, the mysterious civilizers remembered by the Mayans, the Sumerians, and the Egyptians alike. Everywhere they went, they built anew, teaching agriculture, mathematics, the measurement of time. But what they preserved best was memory. In myths, in symbols, in ritual alignments of temples and stars, they encoded the blueprint of a world that no longer existed. The deeper we look into ancient structures, the more this memory seems deliberate. The Great Pyramid of Giza, aligned, within fractions of a degree to true north. The layout of Teotihuacan reflecting the positions of the planets. The megaliths of Stonehenge and Nabta Playa, marking solstices with astronomical accuracy. These are not random feats. They are the language of science spoken in stone. They suggest a worldview not born from superstition, but from precise observation, one that saw the earth and sky as reflections of a single order. It is tempting to see in them the echo of a once universal system of knowledge, preserved and repeated by those who remembered fragments of something grander. Even the legends of great floods carry a strange consistency. From Mesopotamia's Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical Genesis, from the Aztec story of Tata and Nena to the tales of Manu in India, the flood is always the same: a divine punishment, a cosmic reset, a cleansing of the world. But beneath the religious overtones lies a deeper truth: that humanity experienced a real and global deluge and that some few survived. Those survivors became the ancestors of post-diluvian civilizations. If they carried with them even traces of the science, the maps, the architecture of their fallen world, it would explain the sudden flowering of civilization we see around 3000 BCE, the abrupt emergence of agriculture, writing, and monumental construction, as though knowledge returned rather than arose. Among those who chase this mystery, one question burns brighter than all. Could there really have been a global civilization before the flood? Not a single empire, perhaps, but a network. A communion of seafaring cultures sharing knowledge across vast distances. Evidence suggests ancient peoples navigated the oceans long before recorded history. Artifacts out of place. Coconuts, found in ancient Egyptian tombs, South American cocaine traces in mummies, stones carved in the same style on opposite sides of the Atlantic, hint at forgotten contact. Even the mythic figures who appear across continents share uncanny similarities. Quetzalcoatl, Thoth, Oannes, Viracocha, all teachers from the sea, all bearers of wisdom, all bearded men who came after the flood to rebuild. It is as if humanity remembers the same archetype in different tongues. If they were real, who were they? Not gods, perhaps, but survivors, remnants of a people whose world had drowned. They may have been astronomers who mapped the heavens to predict the next catastrophe, or priests who guarded the remnants of ancient science, or engineers whose technology was mistaken for magic. Over time, their descendants would forget the reasons for their knowledge, preserving only the rituals. Myths would replace memory. The builders would become gods. The maps would become myths, and the flood would pass into legend. And yet something of them remains. In every great culture that rose from the ashes, we find an obsession with the heavens. The Egyptians oriented their pyramids to Orion and Sirius. The Mayans tracked Venus with near-perfect accuracy. The builders of Angkor Wat aligned their temples to solstices and equinoxes. Why this universal fixation on the stars? Perhaps because the stars were the key to the old world, a calendar of catastrophe, a warning encoded in the sky. Perhaps the ancient priests were not worshipping the heavens but reading them, remembering the pattern that once destroyed their ancestors. If so, then their temples were not mere shrines. They were observatories, timekeepers, safeguards against forgetting. Modern science, too, begins to uncover what myth long whispered. Geological studies confirm a sudden melting around 12,000 years ago, a pulse of sea level rise and planetary upheaval, what some call the Younger Dryas impact event. Fragments of cometary debris, impact craters beneath ice, and layers of carbon-rich sediment suggest that something struck the Earth then, triggering global fires and floods. If a civilization had existed in coastal plains now drowned, the shelves of the Atlantic, the Sunda lands of Asia, it would have been erased without trace. What we call prehistory may simply be the amnesia that followed. And yet, so often something stirs in that silence, a discovery that seems to remember what history forgot. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9600 BCE, emerged from the earth like an accusation against our timeline. Its stone circles, older than agriculture, carved with precise astronomical and symbolic motifs, tell us that organized civilization existed, millennia before we believed possible. Who built it? How did hunter-gatherers without cities or metal raise pillars weighing 20 tons and decorate them with mythic animals? It is as if the first chapter of civilization was torn out and buried, and now slowly the earth is returning it to us. If Göbekli Tepe was built by survivors, the first attempt of a remnant culture to preserve memory, then it stands as humanity's oldest monument to survival. The flood came, and yet the memory endured. The builders inscribed their story, Not in words, but in symbols, animals, stars, cycles, messages meant to outlast the next forgetting. And indeed they did. Across time, that memory unfolded into Egypt's temples, Sumer's ziggurats, the myths of gods who descended after the flood. The echoes of that first civilization, dim and distorted, shaped every myth that followed. We are not the beginning. We are the continuation of something ancient that refused to die. Still, skepticism remains. Archaeologists warn against weaving romance into science. They remind us that human ingenuity needs no lost golden age to explain its wonders. But even they cannot ignore the synchronicities, the shared architecture, the parallel myths, the sudden leaps of knowledge in separate continents. If there was no connection, why do so many stories begin with the same fall? Why do they all speak of gods descending from the sea, of floods that erased a great age, of teachers who came afterward to rebuild? There is a pattern here, as old as memory itself. Too universal to be coincidence, too persistent to be dismissed. Perhaps the truth lies between myth and science, in that space where the symbolic becomes real. The Atlanteans may not have been a single people, nor Atlantis a single place. Perhaps Atlantis is a name for an era, for all the lost coasts that vanished when the ice melted. Perhaps those who survived were scattered tribes who remembered fragments of a once global knowledge, each retelling the story in their own tongue. Over time, these fragments became the legends of Thoth and Quetzalcoatl, the maps of Piri Reis, the alignments of pyramids. Like shards of a broken mirror, they all reflect a single lost image, a vision of humanity before the forgetting. If that is true, then our own age is not the first to hold the world in its hands. We are not pioneers, but rediscoverers, heirs to a wisdom older than writing, older than memory. And maybe that explains our strange longing for the past, our obsession with ruins, our hunger to decode what came before. Somewhere deep within us, something ancient stirs, remembering what it was like to know the stars not as distant fires but as coordinates, to walk on lands now drowned, to build monuments that spoke to eternity. Every discovery we make, every map, every temple, every fossilized dream, is not a step forward, but a step back toward remembering. The echoes of that lost civilization still call to us. Through myth, through geometry, through the faint lines of a forgotten map. Whether they were Atlanteans, priests, or astronomers matters less than what they represent. The proof that knowledge, like spirit, cannot be destroyed, only hidden. The flood may have wiped the slate clean, but beneath the silt, the memory endures. Every civilization since has been, in some way, an act of recollection, an attempt to rebuild what was lost, to redraw the map of a world that once was whole. Perhaps one day the earth will reveal more. The ruins beneath the seas, the archives of stone buried under ice. And when we find them, we will not be discovering the future, but finally remembering our past. For now, all we have are the echoes, faint, haunting, yet persistent enough to remind us that history is not a straight road from ignorance to enlightenment. It is a circle, and we have walked it before. Maybe that is the real meaning of the flood. Not destruction, but renewal. The old world sank, so the new one could rise. The teachers became myths, so their lessons could live longer than their names. The maps were forgotten so we could find them again and wonder. And in that wonder lies the oldest truth of all, that knowledge, like the tide, always returns. They lie in archives and museums, these strange parchments, faded, yellowed, sometimes half-burnt at the edges, their lines trembling with the hands of forgotten cartographers. To the untrained eye, they are just old maps, relics of the Renaissance age when sailors stitched together coastlines like threads in a tapestry of discovery. But to those who look closer, they whisper a secret that should be impossible, an understanding of the world centuries ahead of its time. Among them are the Orontius Phineas map of 1531 and the Boache map of 1737, artifacts that seem to know things their creators could not. They show coastlines buried beneath ice, river systems hidden, under glaciers and mountain ranges no human eyes had seen. Together, they form a puzzle that stretches beyond history, a cartographic connection hinting that the story of human knowledge is far older and more intricate than we have been taught to believe. To understand their mystery, one must begin with the mindset of their age. The 16th and 17th centuries were times of unrelenting curiosity. The known world was expanding like a living organism, its veins and bones traced by explorers who risked everything to reach the edges of the map. Empires rose on the backs of navigators. Cartography was no longer art, it was power. Every new island drawn, every strait measured, could decide the fate of nations. In this feverish era, maps were more than geography, they were instruments of ambition. And yet, in the midst of this obsession with discovery, a few maps appeared that seemed not to belong to their time. The first was the Orontius Phineus map, published in 1531. Orontius Phineus, or Oronce Phineus, as he was known in France, was a respected mathematician and cartographer, a man of precision, not fantasy. His map of the world, engraved on parchment, depicts an Earth recognizable yet not entirely right. Below the familiar outlines of South America and Africa, he drew a vast southern continent, Terra Australis, stretching almost from the tip of South America to the Indian Ocean. That in itself was not unusual. The idea of a southern land had long existed in medieval thought. But what set Phineus apart was not that he imagined a continent, it was that he mapped it with alarming accuracy. His Terra Australis is not a vague blob, but a detailed landmass with coastlines, rivers, and mountain ranges that align uncannily with the true shape of Antarctica. Not as it appears today beneath miles of ice, but as it exists beneath the ice, as revealed by 20th century seismic surveys. The resemblance is so exact that some have wondered, how could a 16th century scholar have known what lay under frozen miles of the South Pole when no one had ever been there? For centuries, the Orontius Phineus map was dismissed as conjecture, an imaginative projection of what the southern hemisphere might contain. But when scientists in the 1950s used sonar and radar to map the subglacial topography of Antarctica, they found something unsettling. The mountain ranges and bays beneath. The ice matched the Phineus depiction far too closely to be coincidence. His map even includes the Ross Sea, partially ice-free, suggesting that whoever first charted it saw the land in a time when it was not buried, an era that could only have existed more than 6,000 years ago, before the last great glacial expansion. It was not the only such map. Over 2 centuries later, in 1737, another appeared, the Boitier map, created by Philippe Boitier, a French geographer and royal cartographer. Boitier was a visionary thinker, fascinated by the hidden structure of the Earth. His map of Antarctica was published long before the continent's official discovery, and yet it depicted the land divided into 2 major landmasses with a central sea, precisely what modern geological research has revealed beneath the ice. The Boitier map showed rivers flowing from the interior to the coast, and a continental shelf strikingly similar to what sonar would later confirm. Boitier claimed that his work was based on ancient sources, fragments of older maps preserved in libraries and passed down through antiquity. He did not claim invention. He claimed inheritance. And that phrase, ancient sources, rings like an echo through time, the same echo heard in the writings of Piri Reis 2 centuries before. Over and over we find cartographers admitting that their knowledge came not from discovery, but from something handed down, something older than memory. What were these sources? Who drew the originals from which the Renaissance cartographers copied their work? When one overlays the Piri Reis map of 1513, the Orontius Phineus map of 1531, and the Boitier map of 1737, an eerie pattern emerges. All 3 display knowledge that should not exist: the accurate placement of South America, the near-perfect depiction of Africa's shape, and the detailed ice-free outline of Antarctica. They differ in detail, but together they trace the same underlying geography, as if each was a faded copy of a single ancient original. It is as if fragments of one global chart, drawn long before recorded history, survived the collapse of civilizations and resurfaced piece by piece through the hands of mapmakers centuries apart. Modern historians explain these anomalies by suggesting coincidence, extrapolation, or artistic imagination. They argue that the early cartographers merely extended known coastlines southward to fill blank spaces, guessing at what might exist. But the precision of certain details defies this explanation. These are not random curves. They are proportionally consistent, mathematically sound, and geographically valid. The alignment of Antarctica's subglacial features with the Boache and Phineas maps is too accurate to be explained away by fantasy. The odds of such precise correlation by chance are almost incalculable. This leaves a haunting question. Could there once have been a civilization that possessed a global understanding of the planet, a mastery of navigation, geography, and measurement, long before our history begins? To answer that, one must look beyond the maps themselves and into the shifting sands of human time. The last ice age ended around 12,000 years ago, the same epoch that birthed flood legends across cultures from the deluge of Noah to the sinking of Atlantis. At that time, vast tracts of what is now ocean were dry land. If an advanced coastal civilization existed then, its cities would have been swallowed by rising seas, leaving little trace. What if those people had mapped the world as it once was, and what survived were the echoes of that lost cartography, copied and recopied through millennia? Some modern researchers, like Charles Hapgood in the 20th century, proposed exactly that. In his book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, Hapgood suggested that the Phineas, Boache, and Piri Reis maps were derived from a global survey conducted by an ancient seafaring civilization, one capable of precise longitude measurements, impossible before the invention of the chronometer. Albert Einstein, reviewing Hapgood's work, admitted that while the idea was extraordinary, it was not altogether impossible. The mystery, he wrote, lay not in disproving the data, but in explaining how it could exist. If Hapgood was right, then these maps are not just drawings. They are windows into a forgotten world. They suggest that our ancestors were not primitive wanderers, but skilled astronomers, navigators, and scientists. Perhaps they observed the Earth from the sky, or from high vantage points now lost, mountain observatories, or even technologies we can no longer imagine. Their knowledge may have been passed down through oral tradition, encoded in myths and symbols, eventually finding refuge in the archives of Egypt, Alexandria, and Byzantium, from where the Renaissance cartographers unknowingly inherited it. But even if we remove the romance of lost civilizations, the question remains: how did so many pre-modern mapmakers depict features that only modern science has confirmed? It is as if there exists an unbroken thread of geographic awareness, a subterranean current of knowledge that flows beneath history's surface, surfacing when humanity is ready to listen again. The maps are its language. When one stands before the Orontius Phineas map, the sense of awe is immediate. The script curls like waves, the coastlines glint under the varnish of centuries. In its lower hemisphere, the imagined land of Terra Australis seems almost to breathe. Not an invention, but a memory. The contours of the coast, the bays that correspond with real geography, it all suggests observation. Could ancient mariners have sailed that far south, in a time when the climate was milder and the seas navigable? Geological evidence supports the idea that the Antarctic coast may have been ice-free at least in part during the interglacial periods of human prehistory. If so, the map may indeed reflect real journeys, recorded by people we no longer remember. The Boache map, too, carries this strange quality of remembrance. Philippe Boache was fascinated by the hidden structure of the Earth. He believed that subterranean water systems connected continents and influenced global climate. His vision, though speculative, was strikingly prescient. The rivers he drew, beneath the Antarctic ice, once dismissed as fantasy, have now been confirmed by radar mapping. Networks of subglacial streams flowing for hundreds of miles. The two-part division of the continent, which he intuited, is now established. Geological fact. His map was wrong in many ways, but right in the ones that mattered most. Coincidence? Perhaps. But when coincidences begin to accumulate into patterns, one must start to wonder whether they are coincidences at all. Imagine the possibility that these maps, scattered across centuries, are the fingerprints of an ancient world. Order. A memory passed from one epoch to the next. A knowledge so profound it became myth, and then myth became silence. The Renaissance mapmakers, brilliant but blind to the origins of their sources, may have been the unwitting scribes of a civilization that perished before the dawn of history. What is most haunting is not that these maps exist, but that they align, not only with each other but with modern science. Their shared language suggests continuity, a chain of transmission spanning millennia. Somewhere in that chain, perhaps, was the Library of Alexandria, its scrolls containing ancient geographies, copied from even older ones. When the library burned, most of that inheritance turned to ash, but fragments survived. They resurfaced in the Ottoman archives, in European collections, in the hands of scholars who thought they were merely preserving the work of Greeks or Romans, unaware that behind those names lay something older still. There is in this idea a strange comfort and a quiet warning. If such a civilization existed, its memory warns us that knowledge, no matter how advanced, can be lost. That the earth can wipe clean the marks of even the greatest empires. We stand, perhaps, on the ruins of our own forgotten ancestors, measuring the world they once knew better than we do now. Even if the maps are misinterpreted, even if every anomaly can be explained by guesswork or coincidence, they still tell a deeper truth. That humanity has always sought to know the whole earth, to draw it, to understand it. The cartographers of old, even when wrong, were participating in the same mystery we chase today, the mystery of where we came from and how much we have forgotten. There is a strange poetry to this continuity. The Orontius Phineus map, drawn in ink and hope, becomes not merely a document of geography but a bridge across time. The Boache map, with its rivers under ice, speaks not only of the Earth's structure, but of the persistence of imagination. Each map, whether misunderstood or miraculous, is a record of the human mind reaching beyond its limits, a gesture toward wholeness in a world perpetually fragmented by forgetting. Perhaps that is the true meaning of the cartographic connection. Not that these maps prove the existence of a lost civilization, but that they remember it, unconsciously, symbolically, through patterns of geometry and intuition that survived long after their makers were gone. Every age rediscovers a fragment of the same vision, the same yearning to see the world complete. And maybe, in the end, that is what the maps are trying to tell us. That knowledge is not linear. It does not belong to one age or one people. It moves in cycles like the tides rising and falling, revealed and concealed. The world we think we know is only the latest chapter in an older story, one written in coastlines erased by ice and redrawn by memory. In some dim library, a scribe once copied a map from a scroll already ancient in his day. The ink dried, the parchment folded, the names of its makers forgotten. Centuries later, a scholar unrolled it and wondered at its strangeness, its impossible precision. And now, we do the same. Gazing at these artifacts through glass, our reflections mingling with their fading lines. Perhaps that is fitting. For in their mystery we see ourselves, map makers, explorers, and dreamers tracing the edges of the unknown, still searching for the lost origin of our knowledge. The maps should not exist, and yet they do. And maybe that is the oldest truth of all, that even when civilizations fall, the earth remembers. And sometimes, through the trembling hand of a cartographer, it lets us remember too. The stars have always watched us. They glittered over deserts, shone upon the masts of ancient ships, and trembled in the ink of parchment when hands long turned to dust tried to map the earth below by looking upward. In their cold, steady light, humankind found both wonder and terror, a geometry too perfect to be accidental, too eternal to belong only to chance. Somewhere between faith and science, between revelation and reason, the first maps of the world were born, not as mere representations of land and sea, but as sacred diagrams, attempts to translate the music of the spheres into lines and symbols. When we look upon those early maps, the Piri Reis, the Orontius Phineus, the Boache, we do not just see coastlines, we see conviction. We see a people who believed that to draw the earth was to speak to the divine, to engage in the art of creation itself. They believed perhaps that geometry was holy, that numbers were the hidden grammar of the cosmos, and that to know the world's shape was to glimpse the mind of God. And yet beneath the grace of those lines lies a haunting question. How did they know? How could men, bound by the limits of their century, inscribe the contours of lands buried beneath ice, or trace meridians that align so cleanly with celestial coordinates only rediscovered by astronomers millennia later? Were they merely intuitive geniuses, or were they guided by something greater, a remnant of an ancient science now forgotten, or perhaps a whisper from the heavens themselves? There are those who say that the old maps carry echoes of a time when earth and sky were not separate realms, when priests were scientists and temples were observatories, when navigation was not about distance but about harmony, the resonance between the soul of the traveler and the pulse of the stars. In that age, perhaps, a map was not just a tool but a prayer, a ritual to keep the earth in alignment with the heavens. In the deserts of Egypt, amid the ruins of forgotten sanctuaries, certain inscriptions speak of the watchers of the poles, men who studied the movement of the stars to preserve cosmic balance. Their calculations were not for trade or conquest, but for something deeper, to ensure that the world did not drift from divine order. In the geometry of the pyramids, in the layout of ancient cities like Teotihuacan and Angkor, there is a no-undiagnosed intelligence that feels both human and transcendent, angles that correspond to the solstices, axes that mirror constellations. Could it be that these same minds, or their descendants, encoded the Earth's proportions onto maps that somehow survived the ruin of their civilizations? The earliest cartographers, it is said, were guided by instruments unlike any we possess today: crystalline lenses, celestial spheres, magnetic compasses of near supernatural precision. But beyond the instruments, they possessed a kind of spiritual sight, an understanding that mapping the world was also mapping the soul. To measure the earth without knowing the heavens was to them folly. Each coastline was a verse, each mountain range a chord in the harmony of the cosmos. And perhaps that is why so many of the mysterious maps seem to pulse with a strange familiarity, as though their makers had glimpsed the planet not from its surface, but from above, in communion with something far greater than human vision. The idea is both impossible and seductive. Could there have been knowledge before knowledge, a science so pure it was mistaken for magic? We cannot help but notice how many of these ancient maps align with celestial grids, not the random scatter of stars, but organized systems of correspondence. The Antarctic coast on the Piri Reis map, for instance, mirrors the arc of certain southern constellations visible only in ancient times. The Orontius Phineus map's depiction of river valleys beneath the ice reflects not just topographic intuition, but celestial proportion, as if the heavens had been projected onto the earth's hidden skin. In sacred geometry, such alignments are no accident. They are signs of balance between above and below, the Hermetic principle, as above, so below, etched in parchment long before the phrase was ever spoken. To the ancients, geometry was not an invention. It was a revelation. Pythagoras did not create the theorem that bears his name. He discovered it, or perhaps remembered it. The ratios that govern the harmony of sound, the symmetry of seashells, the spirals of galaxies, all, they believed, were expressions of the same divine architecture. So when they traced coastlines or calculated distances, they were not charting mere geography. They were attempting to rediscover the lost music of creation itself. In monasteries and observatories, in temples and towers, the mapmakers worked. By candlelight, their ink mixed with minerals, their compasses fashioned of bronze. But their eyes were elsewhere. They saw patterns in the slow dance of Venus, in the cycles of lunar eclipses, in the rhythm of the tides. They drew not what they saw, but what they understood, and perhaps what they remembered from an age before the flood, when the stars spoke more clearly to humankind. There are stories, dismissed by many yet curiously persistent, that speak of a lost science of orientation, one that used the resonance of stone and the vibration of sound to map the Earth's energy fields. Such theories border on myth, yet when one stands before the Nazca lines or gazes upon the geometrical perfection of Machu Picchu, it is hard not to feel that something more than chance guided those hands. The Earth itself seems to hum with an order invisible yet unmistakable, as if the ground remembers what the maps only hint at. The Renaissance cartographers inherited fragments of that ancient wisdom, passed through Arabic scholars, Alexandrian archives, and forgotten monastic libraries. But as the centuries turned, faith in divine order gave way to empirical measurement. The maps grew more accurate, but perhaps less meaningful. The stars became data points, not deities. The compass became a tool, not a relic. The mystery faded, replaced by precision. Yet the question remains, could precision alone have guided those early masterpieces? Or was there still, beneath their logic, an echo of the sacred, a whisper from a time when every line drawn upon the earth was also drawn upon the heart? It is strange to think that even now, our most advanced instruments still rely on the same celestial principles. The GPS satellite is but a mechanical star, orbiting in patterns once charted by ancient seers. Our maps may be digital, our compasses electronic, but the geometry has not changed. We still find our place by triangulating against the heavens, just as the ancients did. Perhaps we have not outgrown their faith, only renamed it. In certain quiet corners of the world, however, the old tradition lingers. In Polynesia, navigators still read the waves by starlight, feeling the pull of constellations in their bones. In the deserts of Arabia, Bedouin guides still trace the heavens to find their way, trusting in an inherited intimacy between sky and sand. These are not remnants of superstition. They are the living memory of a truth once universal, that, to know the earth, one must first know the stars. Perhaps the maps that should not exist are not impossible at all, but the work of people whose relationship with the cosmos was different from ours. They did not see themselves as apart from creation, but as participants in it. The lines they drew were acts of harmony, not conquest. Their instruments may have been guided as much by prayer as by measurement. And if their maps seem impossibly accurate, it may be because they measured more than land and sea. They measured the rhythm of being. There is in every age a temptation to divide the mystical from the scientific, to believe that what cannot be proved must not be true. Yet history whispers otherwise. It tells us that the first scientists were mystics, the first astronomers were priests, and the first maps were sacred diagrams. The human need to understand is both an act of curiosity and of faith. The two are not enemies but reflections, one earthly, one celestial. When we gaze at the ancient maps yellowed and cracked by time, we are not merely studying cartography. We are looking at a philosophy, the belief that knowledge and reverence are twins. The cartographers were, in their way, theologians, their charts, a kind of scripture. Each coordinate, each latitude, a line in a cosmic psalm. And if some part of their understanding has been lost to us, perhaps it is because we ceased to listen for the music that guided them. Imagine, then, that an ancient hand, guided by light filtered through crystal, traced a coastline not from observation but from memory, the memory of a world before it changed, before seas rose and lands sank. That hand, steady and reverent, might have felt that in recording the earth, it was preserving a fragment of divine order. Its compass needle, trembling toward the poles, was not just obeying magnetism, it was pointing toward eternity. The question of ancient science or sacred guidance may, in the end, be a false one. Perhaps they are the same. Perhaps science in its purest form is the reverent decoding of God's geometry, and sacred guidance, in its truest form, is the intuition that leads a mind toward understanding. The maps we call impossible might then be neither miracles nor mysteries but memories, the fading traces of a time when humankind still remembered how to read the stars as scripture. And as we stare upon those maps now, in the artificial glow of screens and laboratories, we might feel a strange nostalgia. For beneath all our technology, all our satellites and sensors, the longing remains unchanged. We still seek to know where we are, to understand our place upon this vast and fragile sphere. We still lift our eyes to the same sky that guided the ancients. We still, in some quiet corner of our being, believe that the lines connecting the stars might also connect us to one another and to something greater still. Perhaps that is the real secret the old maps hold. Not a code of lost continents or hidden technologies, but a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is itself sacred, that to measure the world is to love it, that the geometry of the stars and the geometry of the soul are, in the end, drawn by the same hand. And when we unfold those ancient charts, tracing the faded ink with trembling fingers, we might feel just for a moment what those long-vanished cartographers felt, that electric silence between understanding and awe. The moment when the mind touches something vast, when lines on paper begin to breathe, and when the earth, in all its mystery, seems once again to sing in harmony with the heavens. The libraries of the ancient world did not merely store knowledge, they breathed it. They were not shelves of parchment and dust, but sanctuaries of the human spirit. Within their walls, language itself seemed alive. Ink was blood, and words, the pulse of civilization. To enter one of those lost archives, Alexandria, Nineveh, or Timbuktu, was to stand inside the collective mind of humanity, to feel thought shimmering in the air like heat over desert stone. And yet they are gone, burned, plundered, or buried beneath the weight of centuries. But perhaps, just perhaps, something of them survived. If even a single scroll had escaped the flames, one hidden fragment of wisdom, it might have carried within it the seed of all that was lost, the echo of an age when the boundaries between science and the sacred had not yet hardened, when maps and myths and mathematics were written in the same hand. Picture, then, the great library of Alexandria, gleaming in the Mediterranean light. Marble pillars, papyrus rolls stacked higher than a man, corridors perfumed with resin and ink. Scribes moved silently through the halls like priests tending an invisible fire. Here, the world's knowledge gathered from the corners of empire. The geometry of the Egyptians, the astronomy of the Babylonians, the philosophy of the Greeks. There were scrolls describing machines that could move on their own, globes of polished bronze mapping the stars, diagrams of continents whose existence Europe would not rediscover for 2 millennia. The scholars of Alexandria were not simply archivists, they were alchemists of thought, fusing the fragments of every culture into a single flame of understanding, and yet that flame, like all others, was mortal. The library burned, once, twice, perhaps many times. The stories differ. Some say it was Julius Caesar's soldiers who set it alight by accident during battle. Others, that the Christian zeal of later centuries sought to purge pagan wisdom. Still others that it perished quietly, neglected, its scrolls rotting away beneath the Nile's damp breath. However it happened, the result was the same. The greatest collection of knowledge in human history turned to ash. The wind that swept through its ruins carried the dust of languages no one would ever speak again, but legend insists that not everything was lost. Sailors whispered of scholars who escaped by night, bearing bundles of scrolls aboard small boats that slipped into the delta's channels. Some fled east toward the ports of Phoenicia, others south along the Red Sea to lands unknown. They carried with them fragments, tables of stars, maps of strange coastlines, the writings of philosophers whose names would never be recorded again. It is said that in their exile, these refugees from Alexandria became the teachers of future ages, the hidden seed from which later knowledge would sprout. Perhaps among those scrolls was one that contained a map, not of the Earth as it was, known but as it once had been, a record of the planet's form before the seas rose, before ice claimed the poles. If such a map existed, copied and recopied across centuries, it might explain the impossible accuracy of those later charts that seemed to know too much. The faint thread of knowledge that winds through history could have been spun from that single rescued parchment, its truth diluted by time but never extinguished. Far to the east, in the ruins of Nineveh, another library once pulsed with life, the library of Ashurbanipal, last great king of Assyria. There, on thousands of clay tablets pressed with cuneiform, the stories of Mesopotamia were recorded in a script so ancient it seemed to speak directly from the dawn of writing. Astronomical, records, omens, medicinal texts, poems, hymns, histories, all pressed into the damp earth, then baked beneath the desert sun. These were not merely words but patterns, codes in clay, each stroke of a reed stylus a note in the music of civilization. When Nineveh fell in fire around 612 BCE, its library too vanished beneath rubble and silence. Yet unlike the papyrus of Alexandria, the clay endured. Buried for millennia, those tablets would one day rise again, unearthed by astonished archaeologists who could scarcely believe that knowledge so ancient had survived. Among them was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known story in the world, a tale of kings and floods and the search for immortality. But mixed among those myths were records that seemed almost modern, observations of planets, lists of eclipses, calculations of distances and times that suggested a grasp of the heavens far beyond what we thought possible. Who taught them this? The priests of Ur and Babylon claimed their wisdom came from the stars themselves, from beings who descended long ago to instruct mankind. Whether gods or ancestors, their memory was preserved not as worship, but as mathematics. It was through such tablets copied from hand to hand that the architecture of the cosmos passed down the ages, perhaps even finding its way, centuries later, into the lost halls of Alexandria. Knowledge, it seems, does not die, it only burrows deeper. And then, across the desert sands in the city of Timbuktu, another library bloomed like a mirage. In the 14th and 15th centuries, when Europe still groped through the shadow of its dark ages, this Saharan jewel shone with scholarship. Thousands of manuscripts lay hidden in earthen homes and mosques, copied by hand in graceful Arabic script. They spoke of astronomy, geometry, law, medicine, and mysticism, a confluence of African, Berber, and Islamic wisdom that defied the notion of an unlettered continent. The scholars of Timbuktu studied the stars with instruments wrought of brass, calculated the movement of planets, and debated the very structure of the cosmos. Yet time and conquest dimmed that light too. Sand buried roads that once pulsed with caravans, and manuscripts were hidden away to save them from plunder. For centuries they slept in chests beneath the floors of mud brick homes, their pages brittle but unbroken. When rediscovered, they revealed not only the intellect of medieval Africa, but its deep continuity with the knowledge of older worlds. A chain of thought stretching back through Cairo, Baghdad, and perhaps, through whispers and fragments, to Alexandria itself. It is tempting to imagine that some of those manuscripts contained echoes of even earlier wisdom, copies of scrolls that once lined the halls of the great library. A verse translated from Greek to Arabic to Songhai, its meaning blurred but its essence intact. A diagram redrawn by hands that never knew its origin, tracing the same geometric truth that once defined the architecture of the Nile. If we could follow that trail of ink across centuries, what might we find? Perhaps we would discover that human knowledge is a single thread, woven through civilizations like a hidden current. When one empire falls, another gathers what it can from the wreckage. The fire that consumes a library may destroy its form, but not its essence. The idea lives on, whispered, reimagined, reborn in another tongue. And yet there is tragedy in this resilience. For each time the flame is rekindled, something is lost. A nuance, a symbol, a connection between earth and heaven. What survives is a shadow of the original brilliance, distorted yet still luminous. The libraries that perished were not merely collections of information, they were mirrors of the human soul. When they burned, so too did the unity between knowledge and wonder. Between learning and reverence still across the silence faint echoes remain. A scholar in Baghdad pores over a text whose diagrams bear resemblance to a vanished Greek manuscript. A monk in Ireland copies a Latin version of a text whose ancestor was once in Nineveh. A navigator in the Ottoman court consults a map whose sources reach back to Alexandria's golden age. Knowledge travels not like an arrow, but like light refracted through water, bending, splitting, yet still carrying the memory of its source. In this sense, the forgotten libraries are not truly gone. Their ruins are scattered across time, hidden in the sentences of later ages. Every book written since is, in some small way, a resurrection of what was lost. The ink we use, the parchment we turn, the constellations we chart, all are fragments of that first dream, the dream of knowing, and perhaps in the deepest sense the dream has never ceased. For the destruction of a library does not extinguish curiosity. On the contrary, it fuels it. The unknown becomes holy. The absence becomes a wound that knowledge itself seeks to heal. That is why, even now, we search, in ruins, in relics, in rumors, for the trace of those vanished scrolls. The lost catalogue of Alexandria, the missing tablets of Nineveh, the uncounted manuscripts of Timbuktu. Each is a doorway to a world that once believed wisdom could be eternal. Imagine, for a moment, that a single scroll did survive. Perhaps it lies even now, forgotten in some monastery vault, its script faded but legible to the patient eye. Within it might be a map unlike any we have seen, not just of the world, but of the world as it once was. It might show coastlines where oceans now roll, mountains where plains now stretch. It might explain the strange consistency between the impossible maps that haunt history, those that knew Antarctica's shape, or depicted lands buried beneath time. Such a scroll could not have survived by chance. It would have been cherished, copied, disguised, perhaps as a religious text, perhaps as a diagram misunderstood by its copyists. Its guardians might never have known its true origin, only that it was sacred. And through their faith, its knowledge endured. That is how truth often travels, hidden beneath metaphor, carried by devotion. The wisdom of the ancients may survive not in science, but in story, not in parchment, but in myth. The flood of Gilgamesh, the cosmic harmonies of Pythagoras, the sacred geometry of Egypt, all may be fragments of an older understanding, preserved not through reason, but through reverence. When we look upon the ruins of Alexandria, or the recovered manuscripts of Timbuktu, we are not merely seeing the relics of learning. We are glimpsing the anatomy of memory itself, the way humanity refuses to forget, even when it cannot remember. Knowledge does not vanish, it transmutes. The libraries may be gone, but their spirit lingers in every act of curiosity, every spark of discovery. Perhaps that is the true legacy of those forgotten archives. They remind us that destruction is never final, that every burned scroll ignites a new hunger to rebuild, to recover, to reimagine. The ashes of Alexandria became the soil of Renaissance Europe. The tablets of Nineveh inspired the first modern archaeologists to dig deeper into the past. The rediscovery of Timbuktu's manuscripts has already begun to reshape our understanding of African history. From loss, knowledge is reborn, and in that rebirth lies something divine. The ancients may have called it sacred guidance. We call it persistence, the stubborn light that refuses to die. Across the centuries, that light has flickered in 1,000 forms: the torch of a scholar, the lantern of a scribe, the cold glow of a computer screen. Each is a continuation of the same flame that once burned in Alexandria's halls. If we listen closely, perhaps we can still hear it: the whisper of parchment turning, the breath of a scribe reciting to himself, the murmur of the Nile outside, an open window. The libraries are gone, but their music endures. It lives in every question we ask, in every mystery that compels us to seek what was lost. And so the forgotten libraries of the world are not dead. They are dreaming, scattered across the sands of time, waiting for those who still believe that knowledge is not just power, but prayer. One day, perhaps, we will find their echo in an artifact, a fragment of text, or a pattern that reminds us that memory itself is indestructible. Until then, every map drawn, every book written, every equation solved is an offering laid at their invisible altar. For though the buildings have fallen and the scrolls turned to dust, the libraries remain, not in stone or ink, but in us. They say that every map is a memory drawn by trembling hands, that the ink, no matter how black, holds the breath of the one who made it, the pulse of a heart that tried to capture the shape of the world. I think of this often when night folds around the modern hum of my desk lamp and I unroll images of old parchment on a digital screen. The lines flicker between pixels, as if the old and the new are trying to recognize one another across centuries. Somewhere under the faint static of time, I feel something watching. Not a person, but the memory of the earth itself. It begins perhaps with the first scribe who pressed soot and sap into a river's shape. A hand tracing coastlines that no longer exist, recording islands that once rose where now there is sea. The ancients never mapped for commerce alone. Their compasses spun toward mystery. They believed that to understand the earth was to understand the divine, that mountains and stars were made from the same pulse of breath. Each stroke of their ink was prayer disguised as geometry. And yet there's something more haunting in the idea that they weren't guessing. That maybe, long before our satellites, someone knew. When I look at the Piri race map or the contours of Orontius Phineus, I no longer see coincidence. I see echoes, the faint memory of glaciers, the precise curvature of continents hidden under ice for millennia. The scientists say it's impossible. The historians smile politely, pointing to imagination, to rumor, to the tangled errors of early drafts. But the lines do not lie so easily. They whisper, even now, through the dust of libraries and the blue glow of screens. Perhaps humanity did not discover the world. Perhaps it remembered. I imagine the map makers, their rooms scented with wax and smoke, parchment curled like dried skin, the air thick with murmurs of foreign traders. They draw by candlelight, and as their quills move, they listen. Not to voices of men, but to something beneath the surface. A hum that comes from the earth itself, faint but steady, as though the planet keeps singing its coordinates to anyone willing to hear. Maybe they were listening better than we do now. Sometimes I dream of a room that doesn't exist. Its walls are lined with shelves, each stacked with scrolls the color of old bone. A single candle burns in the center. When I touch one of the scrolls, it unrolls itself, revealing the lines of every map ever made, overlaid, interwoven, forming a living anatomy of the world. Rivers like veins, mountains like ribs, the oceans a great heart still beating beneath blue silence. And in the spaces between those lines, something stirs. The memory of places we have forgotten, civilizations swallowed by time but not erased. They are not gone, only folded away like paper awaiting rediscovery. In daylight, that dream dissolves, but traces remain. The scent of wax, the sound of the candle's flame, the sense that knowledge is not lost, only sleeping. There are moments when I think we are close to waking it. When explorers drag their sonar across the ocean floor and see patterns too deliberate to be chance, lines, walls, shapes that once were cities. When archaeologists uncover inscriptions that describe lands that should not exist. When scientists find freshwater fossils deep under the Antarctic ice, as though a green world once lay there. We think we are discovering, but perhaps we are only remembering what the earth has been trying to tell us all along. Ink, after all, is only a mirror. The truth beneath it is older, deeper, unyielding. I've come to believe that each cartographer, whoever lived, felt the weight of that truth, a quiet ache behind the ribs, the pull of something vast. They weren't merely recording geography, they were mapping longing, the human hunger to belong somewhere in the grand design of the cosmos. In some forgotten chamber of Alexandria, I imagine a scholar tracing a coastline with trembling fingers. He's been copying older charts, fragments rescued from shipwrecks and markets, patching together a vision of the world that defies his own age. The air smells of salt and ink. Outside, the sea breathes against the harbor walls. restless as, if aware that it too is being captured in lines. A librarian passes behind him, murmuring something about the danger of too much knowledge. The scholar doesn't answer. He just keeps drawing. And somewhere in the black curve of his line, the earth stirs, recognized. Centuries later, the ideal library burns. Scrolls curl into ash, parchment bursts into flame, and the smoke rises like lost prayers. Yet I can't help but believe that the knowledge didn't die there, that even as the flames devoured those fragile leaves, someone was copying them in secret, carrying fragments across deserts, into monasteries, into memory. Perhaps one of those fragments found its way to an Ottoman admiral's desk in 1513, a remnant of a world that refused to be forgotten. There is comfort in thinking that the truth can travel like that, quiet, unbroken, invisible as a seed. It reminds me that memory is not bound to paper. It survives in whispers, in instinct, in the shapes our dreams take when they drift across the map of sleep. We have all seen those lines, the continents of imagination, the coastlines of longing. We draw them in sand as children, in stories as adults, tracing what we do not yet understand but already know. Tonight, as I sit before the dim light of my screen, I open one of the digital maps again. Antarctica, the cold ghost at the bottom of the world. I slide the overlay of Piri Reis across the modern satellite view. The fit is uncanny, not exact but close enough to unsettle. Beneath the ice, the hidden land waits, just as he drew it. I think of him, the admiral, somewhere on the deck of his ship 5 centuries ago, quill in hand, sketching continents he had never seen. Did he feel a strange certainty guiding his ink? Did the sea murmur its secrets to him as the compass spun? The screen glows pale against the dark. I can almost hear the scratching of quills across parchment, the rustle of scrolls, the pulse of the old world beating through layers of time. We like to believe that progress moves forward, but perhaps it moves in circles, spirals even, returning us again and again to the same truths dressed in new names. The ancients might have seen further because they looked not just outward but inward. They watched the stars, yes, but they also listened to the silence between them. And in that silence, the earth whispered its shape. It's strange. The more I study these maps, the more I feel the boundary between reality and myth thinning. It's as though our ancestors knew that the act of drawing the world was also the act of invoking it. To map was to remember, to bring forth the shape of something that had been before. The ink became a kind of ritual, a binding between mind and matter, memory and sea. When I look long enough, the rivers begin to move, the mountains breathe, the parchment becomes skin. And perhaps that is the oldest truth of all, that the world is not a place we live in, but a being that remembers us. The night deepens. Outside, the wind carries the scent of rain. Somewhere far away, waves are breaking against an unseen shore. I close my eyes, and for a moment, I can almost hear the ocean beneath the ice, the slow shifting of the continents, the sigh of the earth as it turns in its sleep. I think of every map ever made and how each one is both true and false, alive and incomplete. The truth beneath the ink is not in the accuracy of lines, but in the faith that they represent. The belief that we are connected to something larger, older, infinitely more patient than we can fathom. The rain comes softly, tapping at the window, like fingers reminding me that the present still exists. The sound draws me back from the drift of thought, but not entirely. Some part of me still walks among the old maps. I imagine the ink drying in slow whirls under candlelight, the faint scent of animal glue and crushed berries, the steady breathing of the one who draws. There is something almost sacred in that quiet, one mind trying to mirror the infinite. Sometimes, I wonder if those ancient cartographers understood that their work would outlive them, that centuries later strangers would bend over glowing screens, hearts quickened by the same sense of wonder. I like to think they did. Perhaps that knowledge was the hidden warmth that kept them at their desks through long nights, the belief that truth is a current, that if they could capture its direction, others would follow it home, and so the current continues. Every age redraws the world, adjusting the lines, naming and renaming the same seas. But the essence remains. Beneath the printed borders and the crisp geometry of modern projection, the old pulse still moves. I can feel it sometimes when I hold an atlas, the faint tremor of something alive under the paper. Maps are not dead things. They breathe through us. Each time we trace a route, we awaken what was sleeping. The modern world thinks in coordinates and data, yet even satellites orbit on a kind of faith that there is meaning in measurement, that mapping can touch the truth. We send our eyes into space, our sensors under ice, and still the Earth keeps her secrets. She lets us see her surface, but her memory is deeper. Perhaps it is stored in magnetic fields, or in the rhythm of tides, or in the soft hum that fills the planet like a heartbeat. I imagine that hum once guided the ancients, not as sound but as intuition. They didn't calculate, they remembered. The truth beneath their ink came not from mathematics but from listening. What if that is what we've lost? Not knowledge, but attention. There's a story, half legend, about a monk who lived on an island in the northern sea. He spent his life copying old manuscripts brought by travelers, fragments of maps, notes of journeys, sketches of coastlines lost to storms. He never left the island, yet in his maps, he drew the entire world. Webby asked how he knew its shape. He said that when he prayed, he could feel the curvature of the earth beneath his knees. No one believed him, but when the tides washed his monastery away years later, the maps were found sealed in jars, their lines uncannily accurate. Perhaps he wasn't drawing from sight, but from memory older than his own. The more I think of him, the more I understand that mapping is not about seeing, but about remembering where we belong. The world is drawn into us before we draw it onto paper. The rivers of our veins echo the rivers of the land. The branching of neurons mimics the branching of trees. We are maps of the same design, walking on the skin of the greater body that birthed us. It is no wonder, then, that the ancients linked heaven and earth in their geometry. They saw what we forget, that the cosmos and the soil are reflections. To trace one was to reveal the other. Their maps were not tools but hymns, a way to praise the balance between stars and stones. Even now, when I look at those delicate arcs and lines, I feel the old reverence. The cartographers must have felt it too, that trembling awareness of touching something sacred. Yet for all our progress, we treat the world as something to measure rather than revere. We chart, we mine, we extract, we digitize. But data cannot capture wonder. Precision cannot hold awe. And still the old maps survive, whispering in museums and archives. Their edges curled, their ink faded, yet their presence stubborn as memory itself. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear them whispering. Not in words, but in the soft crackle of parchment, the shifting of pages, the ghostly rustle of paper as air moves through shelves. They murmur like waves, like the wind moving through long grass, like the breathing of the planet in sleep. They tell me that truth is not fixed. It's fluid, like ink before it dries. It changes shape depending on the light, yet the essence, the pulse beneath the pigment, remains the same. I think again of the idea that humanity did not discover the world, but remembered it. There is comfort there, but also melancholy, because to remember means we once forgot. What was the moment of forgetting? Was it when the Library of Alexandria burned? When the old star temples crumbled? Or has forgetting always been a part of knowing, a rhythm of loss and rediscovery that keeps us searching? Perhaps forgetting is not failure, but invitation. The maps that shouldn't exist, the coastlines, drawn centuries before their time, the stars that align with sacred mountains, all of them are reminders that the past still calls to us. The earth has not stopped speaking. We have only stopped listening. I close my eyes again and imagine the admiral, the monk, the scholar, the nameless hands that traced the world before ours. They are all part of the same lineage, cartographers, of memory, keepers of the pulse. Their ink is dry, but their vision lives in the quiet corners of our curiosity. We find it when we stand before a globe and feel that sudden tug of wonder, that yearning to know what lies beyond the edge. We are all still trying to finish the same map. Outside, the rain deepens into a steady rhythm. The room smells faintly of paper and dust. I turn off the lamp and let the glow of the monitor fade, but the images remain behind my eyelids. Lines, shapes, oceans folding into continents. The world rearranges itself in silence. I realize that every time we draw it anew, we change, ourselves a little too. The act of mapping is the act of becoming, and so perhaps the truth beneath the ink is not the shape of the earth at all. It is the shape of us. Our need to understand, to remember, to reach across the centuries toward the echo of our own origins. The maps do not tell us where to go. They remind us who we are. When sleep begins to take me, I feel the world breathe. Slow, patient, alive. Somewhere in the dark, continents drift imperceptibly. The same ocean that carried ships of explorers now hums beneath the satellite's gaze. Everything moves. Everything remembers. The lines we draw are only surface reflections of a deeper design, one written in the bones of the planet and the bones of our hands. The last thing I think before slipping into dream is that perhaps the earth has always known its shape. We are the ones who must keep rediscovering it, again and again in ink and song and silence. The maps are not messages from the past, but mirrors for the present, showing us how far we've wandered from our own memory. The rain stops. The world holds its breath. And for a heartbeat, or maybe forever, it feels as though the planet itself is remembering too, tracing, with invisible fingers, the forgotten lines of its own skin.